debate and situation. And at least in my case, I'm a member of the European People's Party family, which is the biggest.
Yeah.
Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker sits at the same table when we meet in Brussels next time in December. And I shared with many, with people like Nicolas Sarkozy, who is back at the table from France, that to start with quota as the beginning of the answer or the system was wrong, was not a good beginning. But to deal now with the situation seriously and really is a must for all, individually, for countries, and also for the community. Central Europe has different history. I'm happy you use term central. For decades, I had to oppose we are Eastern Europe. We are not Eastern Europe. There is Western, Central, Eastern. There is European mosaic of different countries, different regions, different languages, different cultures. Europe is very old, nice, and valued or precious diversity and unity. And Central Europe means something in the center, something what was a battlefield between the big powers in the past during the century of fears. It's a notion of Ilya. That's an important. Now I'll come to this. It is something where these countries were part of ethnic purges when more totalitarian time has flown than freedom. A very limited decades of democratic experience. Now we have 25 years of freedom. It's one generation, one university life means a new experience with freedom, responsibility, common Europe, and all these acquis and multicultural society around. But also my response was, if not compulsory quota, but functioning and responsible solidarity. Because solidarity is something which must be based more on people-to-people relationship than bureaucratic or administrative relationship. And this response in my spectrum, in my party, is there. I oppose my Prime Minister to sue European Union because of quotas. It's something dubious. And this term was used by the member of the government of Slovakia. I agree. It's dubious for domestic reasons. There is a lot of politics in the situation. There is a lot of calculation today. And I am against the calculation because it is about
so in your
not
eyes,
money but people now
yeah.
dealing. And we are ready to show and share solidarity.
So you think that Slovakia should accept, in fact, the mandatory quota, even though that was the wrong starting point?
It was the wrong starting point, and Slovakia should claim that the rule of law is important in Slovakia, for Slovakia, in Europe, for Europe.
Yeah.
If legal expert says that rule of law is not good because majority, then I'm against some taxation laws in Slovakia which were not reasonable and are against economic growth in this country. But I have to observe majority and legislation which is valid.
So is it, in your eyes, is it acceptable for a member state of the European Union to limit their refugee intake, say, to Christians? Or to
Look, asylum
whites?
No. Asylum procedure is based on strict rules, and we are a country which observes international and national legislation. It's not based on religion or race.
Yeah.
So I oppose this approach. For future, for long term, for integration, of course there are significant sensitivities, but this is not issue of asylum seeking and asylum treatment. No.
Well, I think we'll come to that in the next round. A final political question, and then we'll move on. How do you perceive the role of Angela Merkel in this crisis? Has she been throwing her weight around too much? Has she been creating problems for others, or has she been showing moral leadership? or all of the above?
Simple question, but not so simple situation and answer. If I mentioned constitutional crisis,
Yeah.
economic and financial, and I know what it was inside, and I was there when Angela Merkel replaced Gerhard Schröder. I was in the commission, in Prodi's commission, and then Barroso's. She brought a lot of pro-European commitment, balanced approach vis-à-vis smaller states. It was not kind of curatorium or directorium against the rest. And I think she helped significantly, decisively to address constitutional crisis, economic and financial. Nothing is perfect, nobody is perfect. And her role was unreplaceable in those years and decade. On this sort of situation, I would say that messages from largest European EU country on readiness to absorb, to accept up to 800,000 refugees. Messages spread very easily and swiftly throughout an outside continent meant, for example, that in Syria or in refugee camps, most of people think and believe that they are welcomed and expected in Europe or in Germany. I hope that in Germany, now after Sunday, CDU and CSU and SPD, Merkel and Seehofer and Gabriel will be able to keep on going and to address steps which are necessary now. Otherwise, without Germany and without consolidated approach, we shall not consolidate situation together. And I think that consolidation of the situation is a base for credibility of Europe ad intra and ad extra.
Yeah.
And it will not go without German government led by, or now led by, Angela Merkel.
But there may have been an error in communication in the way Angela Merkel communicated to the Syrian refugees the willingness to
There
receive
is always a lot of simplification, propaganda, misuse by, for example, illegal traffickers, by organized crime.
We've got a question about organized crime. We'll come to that in a second. I wanted to ask first, Mariki Binimi, will the refugees pay for our pensions and our welfare systems?
Yes, for their part, but the integration is the kind of the key word, as I said already earlier. And in certain countries, there are areas where countries have difficulties to get employees. So in certain countries, in certain areas, it really can be of help when more people come to the country. But really what is important is that we can't look at the immigrants or refugees as one group, because they have different origins, different skills, different backgrounds. So, and that actually makes the integration process very challenging, because you need tailored measures. So for some of them, you need to improve the basic skills, but actually the amount of highly educated immigrants and refugees have increased during the years, and we have to take care that there is not either brain waste, which is happening actually now.
So if we invest in them now, then in the long run they will help to pay our pensions and welfare benefits.
We have to think of it as an investment. But when it comes to this brain waste, one interesting figure is that when we look at the well-educated immigrants who have their degrees from foreign universities, so 42% of them work in a lower skilled jobs than what education
so
they have.
We're not taking enough advantage of them.
Yes, but when it comes to those immigrants who have their degrees from the domestic university, there only 22% of them work in jobs with where the requirements are lower than what their education. So there are a lot to be done, and in order also to look at kind of the transparency when it comes to decrees. Of course, in every country you have to be sure that a decree which you have has the same level as you have in your country. But I think the system is not functioning properly when you hear these figures.
That's certainly something to bear in mind. Kati, you want to come in on that?
I just think there is certainly scope for changing the narrative into a lot more positive one. Not only the OECD research, but a number of other studies and research show that there is one area we haven't talked about yet. There is one area of public policy that's the most predictable of all, and that's demography. And this is a continent where the labor is shrinking, which, especially in Central Europe, as Jan would certainly agree, the demographic projections are very dire. And so you have a pool, you will have to look for a pool of labor in the next 10, 15, 20 years in this very country and in all the countries around it and in many parts of Europe. So that's one real sort of driver that should push for integration. But the other aspect is that the people who come here, and it doesn't matter whether they come from a poor background in Africa or whether they are fleeing Syria and Aleppo, the one thing that unifies them, and I agree that they have diverse backgrounds, but the one thing that unifies them is that they are risk takers, they have drive, and hence they are much more likely to be entrepreneurial, right? So it's the best and brightest that go and take the dangerous journey to make it here. So I think that they can, if the policies are done well, and if the countries use the integration capacity that they may have, because it's not a financial and it's not a logistical challenge at these numbers. It's certainly not. Yeah. It's a mental challenge and it's an integration challenge. And if it's done well, they could contribute to making the societies diverse and hence more resilient in this new era of exponentiality and global developments that are hard to adapt to. And if you have a society that's more diverse, it's going to be more adaptable, almost by definition.
Back on that? Sorry,
yes, I just wanted to say that, of course, we are not either saying that this is a kind of a nice story, everybody wins. That is not the case. Yeah. Of course, if the integration doesn't if we don't succeed in that, also certain groups in those countries where a lot of immigrants and also refugees come, and especially when it comes to low-skilled jobs, the native-born could be in much worse position. So I think information delivering is kind of the key, and also we have to be able to deliver all that information, which is not so nice.
Yeah, I was going to come to that there are losers of immigration, and that's the same whether they're refugees or economic migrants or whatever, and those tend to be the people at the bottom of the pile in our own societies, what used to be called the white working class, and they are the people who are, first of all, losers from globalization in general, because they've been priced out of jobs by imports, but also specifically competitors for public spending on housing, schooling, healthcare, and social benefits with the new arrivals, and who I hear in Germany to some extent. I know Jörg Asmussen is still around, or whether he's had to leave us, but one hears stories from Germany that of German working class people saying, all of this money is being spent on accommodating the refugees. What about us? So I think that's certainly something we need to think about. Sorry, Liz, you had a point to make?
I can also speak to that, because I think that's something we're underestimating at the moment. I welcome positive narratives towards migration, but I think we should be very careful about too closely linking economic benefits to refugee populations as a driver for welcoming more. There is an international legal responsibility to protect those in need of protection, regardless of their economic costs and benefits. So, we have to keep that as the headline. And I think the second reason to sort of be very careful about this is there's been a lot of talk over the last few months of, they're Syrian engineers, they're Syrian doctors, this is fantastic, we need these people, and that's great, as long as your Syrian engineering qualification is recognized in the country you arrive in.
Right.
And one of the major challenges for us over the next decade, and this is particularly a challenge for Germany, which has quite a rigid labour market and recognition system, is how do you manage to recognize that qualification and or create the kind of bridging programs and skills development programs that will facilitate access to the labour market at the right level. And one of the ways to think about this is not just investment in recognition of qualifications, but also skills development programs that look at host populations, native communities, as well as new refugee communities, and thinking about that sort of investment for the whole community and population. And here I think there's completely an underserved role for private sector actors here.
Well, that's certainly a message that we would want to pass on to Jörg Asmussen, who in his day job is Deputy Labour Minister and responsible for a lot of those things. We've had some questions from the audience, so I'd like to start by taking one or two that have been sent in anonymously, and then ask some real members of the audience to give us their questions and comments. But first of all, as peripheral EU states, what role can Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria play as positive influences for EU desires, EU wishes in the Western Balkans region, for example, on migration? Kati, these are not quite your clients, because they're already member states, but
Used to be clients.
they're near the clients of DG
They're near
NEAR.
the clients. I would echo my neighbor here on the panel, Jan, and say that first and foremost, uphold the acquis in their own countries.
Yeah.
And certainly, should they become or continue be transit states, not be inclined to be closing borders, etc. But these are all non-Schengen countries, so they are outside of the smaller Schengen space. In the Western Balkans, I think that ironically we are slightly better equipped in providing concrete support than we are inside the EU. Actually, because there is an assistance mechanism in place, we were able very quickly to reorient and reprogram a lot of the assistance towards migration management, border management, work with the host communities, in addition to the humanitarian aid in general. So we are ironically better equipped to react quickly, because a lot of the mechanisms, for example, humanitarian assistance, is only for outside the EU. And this crisis has shown that mechanisms for quick reaction inside the EU may need to be developed in the future as well. They don't exist yet. So we are able to react quicker, and certainly the help of Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia to the Western Balkan countries would be very welcome, because logistical help is needed, expert help is needed, material support is needed. But on our side, on the EU side, I'll just use one example. We were able to reprogram 10 million euros for Serbia and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Between adoption in the Commission and contracting, we spent only 3 weeks, which is like lightning speed for the EU. So certainly help both in terms of personnel and money, material would be most welcome.
Great. Well, there are a couple of issues which we haven't discussed yet, but which are there in the public and therefore reflected in our audience. One is concern about terrorism. The other is concern about organized crime and trafficking. So one question, which I'm going to put to Jan Fiegel, but others are welcome to come in. How do we avoid the known phenomenon with an already mostly integrated Muslim population, where some in the second generation born in Europe turn to terrorism. That's a whole panel subject in itself, probably. And the other one, what link is there between migratory human trafficking and other illicit forms of trafficking? Is there any discussion of the nexus between this crisis and other security threats?
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and maybe I would start with mentioning one book from Israeli author Amos Oz, How to Cure a Fanatic. This is the title, very short, small book, which speaks about dividing line in our lives and societies. It is not between civilizations, it is not between cultures, between people, basically, but it goes through our inner conscience. Either we respect life, respect dignity of everybody, or not. And the other side of the line is fanaticism of any sort, ideological, atheistic, political, religious. You may continue. There are different examples in human history and European history especially of these sorts and waves of fanaticism. Antidotes and response is education, which means knowing more and respecting more, because we may become happier in France, in Germany, in Slovakia, in relationship, not isolated, not solo, not embraced by the walls or fences. And I think that this is phenomenon which speaks by itself, that integration is quite a demanding process. Integration is neither absorption nor assimilation. Integration means participation as equals, taking part on the same civic human base. And for that we need to bring understanding of minorities and majorities together, not to nurture parallel societies as we frequently see, but really help children to grow together, to know the culture of the neighbor, and to build up neighborhood in the neighborhood, not around Europe, but not where people really live. Integration, even European integration, starts at home in the country. It goes on via neighborhood with the neighbors. I'm happy that Visegrad is something what is quite known, and it's not imposed. It is something very European in living together and even working together in political terms. And this is example and contribution also to European policies. I think we still need to learn the best practices, to put together quality and access to education as a double objective, not only access and then you have egalitarian system without quality, or only or solo quality and you have elitistic system. So this is more about education and living together.
Liz, terrorism and trafficking.
Can I add something? Because I think Jan's making an important point.
Very briefly, I can see the audience is getting edgy to ask questions. So
I can draw on the French example
Yeah.
when it comes to integration, and I think identity is very important. There was some research a few years ago in France where they asked a lot of second-generation immigrants, so the children of immigrants, do you feel French? Very high percentage said, yes, I feel French. The second question said, do you think others think you are French? The number dropped. So people who felt French were aware that no one else in France thought of them as French. And the body language of the state is extraordinarily important. If a state says you are or you are not part of us, you are not part of our society, you are in, you are out, that has a strong effect, particularly on the second generation, about how they feel about participating in a society. And we've seen that in a number of countries. And I think we should be very aware of the narratives and the identity issues that are involved with this. And when it comes to human trafficking and smuggling and financing, we haven't looked more closely enough at financing. I mean, there are investigative journalists making links between ISIS and smuggling. I think there are huge crossovers between different criminal networks. This is a very horizontal phenomenon. Many people are migrants themselves, facilitating the next stage of their journey through helping co-nationals across the next stage of the smuggled journey, so they're not necessarily smugglers. There are organized crime networks involved in this. There's a huge diversity of smuggling and trafficking networks.
It's $1 billion business.
But it is a huge business with high profits and extremely low risk. And if you wanted to be involved in other nefarious actors, the barriers to entry are extremely low.
Yeah. I heard Mark Pierini the other day say that it was $1 billion business now this year in Turkey, if you reckon that each family spent on average 2,500 euros to get from Syria to Europe. And most of that money was going to intermediaries in Turkey. Worth bearing in mind. Right, it's your turn. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been very patient. Gentlemen over there, I'll take sort of perhaps 2 or 3 questions at a time. Please introduce yourself, tell us who your question or comment is for, and keep it short. Thank you.
Milan Ižovica, Mesaten, a think tank from Bratislava, Slovakia. The question is to anybody who wishes to answer that. And I'd like to return with no disrespect to the people who are no longer here, to the previous panel. And 2 things intrigued me very much. One was when State Secretary Asmussen spoke about the constitutional right to claim asylum in Germany. And he always makes a very precise argument. And today he also made a very precise argument with one caveat, and that was that he said that the right is unlimited. That means that there's no ceiling, which I think is constitutionally and juristically praiseworthy, and from the point of human rights also praiseworthy. From the point of policy, it's very, I would say, ambiguous, because what I think it does, it encourages anybody abroad to kick out as many people as you would like to from your own country. Because it says, well, we will receive as many as you can kick out. So that's first, maybe some comment from the panelists. And second was, when we are dealing with the refugee crisis in Europe, I think that we are dealing with it both domestically and externally. And domestically, the debate is mostly, I would say, not mostly, but to a great extent, limited to snipping from one prime minister to the other. But what I'm missing is that helping Germany, while we are watching Chancellor Merkel to take a dip in the nasty water, helping to project an argument that there are 145 signatories to the UN Geneva Conventions. This is not solely a European problem. Are we so weak in the European Union that we can't talk to the countries of the Gulf, and we can only say statistically that, well, they haven't taken in anybody, but we have to take in everybody? Isn't it a time that we showed also not only a big heart that we have for everybody, but also some brains and the teeth? Because UN Convention is not just a piece of paper to which you sign and then do nothing. Thanks.
Gotcha. 2 questions. I think they mainly go to Liz, although you didn't say to whom. Gentleman in the front row.
Milan Nič, CEPI think tank based here in Bratislava. 2 questions. One is about a twinning mechanism or bilateral arrangement, which, for instance, this country on one hand tried to turn down or sink down the quotas, the EU relocation mechanism, with some numbers. On the other hand, offered bilaterally to Austria to host temporarily 500 asylum seekers from Austria. And I wonder what would be comments from the Commission and from experts, Liz, about this arrangement. I know Austrian ambassador is in the room and he's listening. Second, Western Balkans over the winter may become a waiting room, a huge, giant waiting room for many refugees. It's partly by design, because what Germany needs is to slow down the whole flow. They cannot handle 10,000 new migrants a day. Maybe they can handle 3,000. So what is the capacity there to house people we know that in Germany now people are intense. What about the Western Balkans? And what can countries like Slovakia, that has a long relationship of friendship and support of Western Balkan countries, do in this? And attached to this for Jan Figel, we will have a presidency of the EU after Dutch. And this migration crisis might decide the success or failure of our presidency, how we handle it. I don't see our Ministry of Interior and other people involved in preparation of the presidency focusing entirely on this. The Dutch are already doing it. So, as a politician, former commissioner, EU negotiator, what would you do if you would be in charge?
Right.
Well, not, but what would you do?
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. Is there a third question in this round? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Can I just say that women are allowed to ask questions too,
Not only on the panel.
as well as answering them?
Thank you very much for the floor. There is autumn. Winter is coming.
Yeah.
There is some project for really decreasing all these problems of migrants walking through several countries. Project of the creation of some, let's say, train bridge or plane bridge, this kind of support. It was discussed because really...
An airlift. A Berlin airlift, as it were. Okay, thank you, sir. That's plenty to ask. Let me start and try and allocate some of those questions. German constitution and European teeth with the Arab world. Liz, would you like to take those?
Sure.
Open-ended asylum.
I would be delighted. The thing about the Geneva Convention and international law is there are some unfinished questions about it. You have the right to claim asylum, but a country also is the one that bestows protection. So it's not necessarily unlimited if countries find other means to offer that protection. And some of the issues, the concepts that are now being discussed in many countries is, can we designate Turkey a safe third country? In international law, under certain circumstances, you can say you have passed through a safe country where you could and have received protection on your way to us, therefore we can send you back to that. Yeah. So there is an unlimited right to claim asylum.
And the same would apply to Iran as a safe country for Afghans.
In theory, you have to meet some very, very strict legal criteria, and the UNHCR is currently revising its guidelines on this, and it'll be interesting to see who and how countries might fall under this rubric, but there are the practical organisation of the right to claim asylum is something that's deeply complex and could allow for quite a lot of movement. I mean, the entire Dublin system is premised on the safe third country concept, except if you're returning people to Greece, obviously. When it comes to internationalising this issue, it's much easier to internationalise the funding side of this issue and do pledging conferences, and there'll be another pledging conference in the new year. It's notable that there will be a World Humanitarian Summit held in Istanbul in May of next year. So there is this moment now to really talk, okay, are we going to bring the international community together to discuss these things together? There are precedents. There was a comprehensive plan of action that was agreed in the 1980s to deal with displacement from Vietnam. Now, while the political and contextual situation in Vietnam was very, very different, there are some lessons to be learned about what it takes for an international community to come together and decide how to equitably divide up responsibility. There is that precedent, and there's growing pressure to talk about either a global resettlement program or some form of international congress that would be able to have this conversation. And it is notable that the US and Canada have been increasingly asking Europeans, what can we do to help? But also countries that have never really been involved in this before. Brazil and Argentina have been offering humanitarian visas to Syrians and taken several thousand each so far. Mexico is getting ready to launch a resettlement program. It's never done that before. There are new actors coming into the field. And when it comes to the Gulf states, I recognize the challenge of sort of how do you ask Gulf states to take refugees? It's not in their sort of philosophy. What is interesting to note is the number of Syrian nationals who've been given labor visas in the Gulf region. And that's something that also happens in Europe. If it's easier to access the labour market than claim asylum, many people will come and try and access the labour market. In Poland, for example, Ukrainians are using the labour migration route rather than the asylum route because it's a lot easier, and it's been made a lot easier. So we should also look at different ways in which people can access protection, which isn't necessarily within the sort of legally defined criteria of the Geneva Convention.
But one sort of possible model that you're pointing to there, or sketching, is that we could put pressure on Saudi Arabia or Qatar or wherever to pay for Syrian refugees to go to Brazil or Argentina rather than Munich.
Interesting. So there are concepts of private sponsorship that are emerging. It's long-standing in Canada,
It's
which
a
is
bit
the
like-
idea of offsetting the costs of resettlement by getting community actors involved.
It's a bit like the American
But
definition
you're
of
suggesting an
Zionism.
international trading of resettlement places.
The American definition of a Zionist is a Jew who pays for a second Jew so that a third Jew should go and live in Israel.
I mean, it may be worth having a global conversation about what an equitable division of responsibility is, when
Yeah.
some of that responsibility is financial and some of that is human, and and what it would actually take. I'm personally not convinced by the idea of trading quotas for humans. And
Yes.
I think that could go in a negative direction.
Fair enough.
But some more innovative, creative responses to get a bigger international response is definitely necessary.
Okay.
This one, may I just
The West
very-
Balkan. I was going to ask you about the West Balkan waiting room, but go on if
Thank
you
you.
want to jump in there.
I'll get to the West Balkan waiting room in a second, but just very quickly on what Liz was saying. Let's not forget, we don't need to talk about Bahrain and Syria, Saudi Arabia, sorry, and Kuwait. I think that the really urgent international and much more stepped up international response that's needed is to help the two countries that are completely overwhelmed and stranded, and not enough attention is being paid to Jordan and Lebanon. They are middle-income countries that
Yep.
are borrowing from the international financial institutions at higher rates than otherwise, and they have a completely non-self-imposed crisis. The systems are overwhelmed, and nobody's paying attention. So let's not forget that there is a reservoir of 2.5 million people just in Lebanon and Jordan. So before we would venture into how to force or cajole Saudi Arabia into taking someone, let's take care of the host communities, and I very much agree that the investment needs to go not only to the refugees but the host communities as well.
Yeah.
And this is another crisis that is very easy to foresee. They are going to get up and move within the next, I don't know whether month or weeks or years, but it's going to come unless we
It's
take
a
a
disaster
resolute.
waiting to happen.
Yes, it's a
Yeah.
disaster waiting to happen,
Yeah.
and not enough attention is being paid.
We've got roughly 10 more minutes.
So the Western
West
Balkans
Balkan
waiting room, the Western Balkans waiting room is exactly what my humble part of the Commission is trying to prevent and argue against. We are very concerned about attempts that are actually vocalized by some member states of sort of desiring to keep the refugees in the Western Balkan countries. I think that particularly former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia is in no shape to have to be hosting huge numbers currently. Serbia is a little better off. The Prime Minister himself spoke about being able to accommodate a dozen, potentially up to 20,000 people, but these are really short-term measures. So I agree there is a huge danger that unless we do it carefully, there could be another bigger problem arising in the Western Balkans. So that is something that is certainly not in the interest of the EU, and I think that you mentioned very well, Slovakia and other countries in the region are very interested in the Western Balkans, and this could be potentially a very concrete way of helping them, both in sending people there as well as maybe exploring the model that we have in Austria. I spoke with the Austrian Ministry of Interior last Friday about the model, and it's a very interesting one.
This is
because
the twinning model. Yeah.
Twinning is a way of, yes, it's a way of calling it.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting model, and also the lesson from it. So Slovakia accommodated 500 asylum seekers for Austria temporarily in a town called Gabčíkovo here. And the residents and the mayor were so worried about it, they actually organized a referendum against it, overwhelmingly against having the asylum seekers stay there. Few months down the line, the mayor himself said, we were needlessly worried. It worked. And so I think that that's very much a lesson. When you look at the Eurobarometer, the countries that have very few migrants are the ones that tend to be most anti-migrant, and the ones where you have experience with them are lower. So I think
we may get a chance, if we're very quick, to ask Mary about her country, which is a country that has very few migrants and is having a nervous breakdown over them. But first, Jan, the Slovak presidency coming up, what should you be preparing for? What would you be preparing for if you were in government?
If I may, I would add maybe 3 points.
Yeah.
First, when I represented political majority, we passed in years 2003, 2004 via Migration Office of Slovakia up to 10,000 refugees, mostly from Pakistan and Afghanistan. No referenda, no problem, no scare. Normally, mature way. Today it's something, I think, pre-electoral. We shall have elections, my friends.
So as an opposition politician who's going to be contesting those elections, do you argue against the Prime Minister, or do you basically ignore the issue, say it's a non-issue, we've done this in the past, let's move on to the real issues, which in my mind are X and Y?
I'm sorry that this gremium doesn't speak too much or very little about the roots of the problem, rather about the realities, situation, and the complexities. If we don't heal the wounds, the roots, we don't have answers, real answers, credible answers, long-term answers to the situation on the continent. So I would respond to Milan Ježovica on German response. I'm happy that Germany now, and since Adenauer, is full of Verfassungspatriotismus, something based on constitution and patriotism and European and foreign policy, which is linked to European policy. Core of German foreign policy is European policy, and that's good for us. That's good for Germany. And I think what is needed to add to this legalistic, constitutional approach that everybody has right. I think they have right to have a country which belongs to people. I mean, refugees from Syria. So let us help Syrian people to get their country back from jihadists, from Caliphate, from ISIS. Yeah. ISIS is the biggest international and global threat. So let us deal with that. Otherwise, we are lost in these nitty-gritty debates. So there is a threat, ultimate threat, and either we do something and eliminate such threat, or we shall have much more difficult situations in Europe of next year. Slovakia's presidency, Minister of Interior has a lot to do, and elections is coming. I think this debate should be with people from Interior Ministry, from Migration Office, and not only in Slovakia, but broadly, more internationally. But it's up to them and up to organizers to invite. What I would do differently, I think, of course, it's important to prepare by action, by doing, not by sort of planning. But the refugee crisis is something long-term, at least we may expect. And what we shall probably need is kind of revitalization or boost of Schengen and security policy. More coherent approach, which means foreign and security policy more together with other policies, humanitarian development. Maybe Schengen group, like we have Euro group of ministers with permanent president and some mechanisms to deal with highly sensitive issue and more sensitive than ever. And it will not be diminished in next years, but even more sensitive, as I say, and we didn't speak too much about terrorism. And of course, we should also prepare prepare for credible Slovak input into this preparation of presidency. So I would go for more active and responsive action. If I was quoted at the tweet that I said people to people solidarity is something important, and then there was something about why do we have institutions?
Yeah.
Everything, and that's quote from either Schumann or Monet. Everything comes through people and remains via institutions. If we want to integrate in France or in Germany or in Slovakia somebody to live together, it must be via people. But institutions, ministries, governments should facilitate, should create conditions which are safe, realistic for people to people living together, integrating together. If not, then we shall have